Hello, Pathfinders. This week, I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation that I put together that addresses one of my all-time favorite topics related to Christmas. I think you're going to enjoy this presentation, and I have a hunch this will be a video that you're going to want to keep and hopefully even share it with others. So let me share my screen with you so you can see the PowerPoint. All right, I have before us here a picture, an astronomy picture of what's happening right now in the nighttime sky. My wife Kathy and I, we take our dog for a walk every evening, and we've been noticing over the past few months the planet Jupiter and the planet Saturn as they are converging closer and closer together. And here in just a couple of weeks, or less than a week, we're actually going to see Jupiter and Saturn converge together. It's going to appear to be like they're one planet in the sky. And you can tell they are obviously the brightest objects in the evening sky. NBC News recently had a story about this, and notice what they call this phenomenon of Jupiter and Saturn coming together. They call it the Christmas star. Look at what they say. The Christmas star will be closest visible conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 800 years. The conjunction of the planetary giants will look like one large star on the winter solstice, December the 21st, 2020, in the southwest sky. And thinking about that phenomenon of the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, I couldn't help but think about a study that we did a couple of Christmases ago about the Star of Bethlehem. You remember the video series that we looked at? The author of this series, he is an astronomy buff, and he took one of the many excellent astronomy software programs that are out there. This one's called Starry Night. This is what he used. And through this computer program, you're actually able to go back at any time in human history, any place on the earth, and you can place yourself there, look up into the skies, and you'll see exactly what an observer back then would have observed at that moment on that day from that place on the earth. This can happen because the planets move with such regularity and precision as they make their way around the sun. They never change. This is very, very predictable. So you can enter in all this information into a computer program, and you can generate any place on Earth at any time in history what an observer would have seen. So let's look at the Bethlehem star, and let's see how God was actually proclaiming the birth of Jesus through the heavens and through some very unusual events that were happening in the heavens on and around the birth of Jesus. I love Psalm 19:1. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." This verse tells us God speaks to us through the heavenly bodies that he created. He's declaring his glory. He's proclaiming the work of his hands. So let's see if God wasn't proclaiming through how he sovereignly arranged certain planetary events to coincide with the birth of Jesus. So let's start by looking at, how do we know when Jesus was born? Well, we can turn to the Bible and we get three very important biblical clues. The first one comes to us from Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. This says, familiar passage about the Christmas story, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod. This is significant because it now gives us a historical reference. It talks about this historical figure, King Herod. So Jesus obviously must have been born during the time of Herod. He had to be born before the death of Herod the Great. Now, Josephus, who is an ancient Jewish historian, he was actually a contemporary of Jesus. He records for us that there was a partial eclipse of the moon on March the 12th of 4 BC, and he notes this event was just prior to Herod's death. And this is why scholars traditionally have dated the birth of Jesus as being in 4 BC. But the oldest manuscripts of Josephus, and these have been discovered just in recent years, the older the manuscripts, closer to the original writings, less chance of errors creeping into the text. So the oldest, best, most reliable manuscripts of what Josephus wrote state that Herod died not in 4 BC, but in 1 BC. And in fact, you can take that astronomy software and you can go back and see that there actually was an eclipse of the moon in that very year of 1 BC. So it's pretty apparent Josephus was saying that Herod died in 1 BC, so Jesus would have been born sometime prior to that death of Herod, so the years leading up to 1 BC. Some people wonder, what's up with this BC? How could Jesus be born BC? How could Jesus be born before Jesus? I think that's an interesting question. And this all has to do with our calendars, our calendar system. So let's get a little history there of how our calendars that we use today came into existence. Back in the year 525 AD, Pope John I commissioned this scholar monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus to establish a feast calendar for the church. And this is the exact same Roman calendar that we use today. But notice how he did this. This monk calculated the year of Christ's birth to be in December of the year 753 after the founding of the city of Rome. So he used that as his reference point. So he designated that year as 1 BC, and the next year there is no zero. So the next January would mark the beginning of AD 1. But here was the problem with the way he did his calendar. There was insufficient historical data available at that time. And when Dionysius arrived at a date for Herod's death, he miscalculated it by about 4 years later than the actual event. Herod only died 749 years after the founding of the city of Rome. So Dionysius made a 4-year error in his calculation. And that's exactly why Jesus's birth is in the BC era on our calendars. So there's a little interesting fact about calendars and about our whole dating system and the birth of Jesus being in the BC period. All right, got that? Second key biblical clue about when Jesus was born comes to us from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Another very important historical marker that Luke adds here. He mentions this historical figure, Quirinius, who was the governor of that area of Syria. So, a census must have been taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And there's not a lot of agreement here among scholars exactly when this particular census would have been taken. But there are historical records that a census just like this was taken in the year 8 BC. And if you think about the fact that everybody had to go to their hometown to be registered for this census, for this tax, that would have been, by the time the decree went out for everybody to go back home, giving time for this to all be registered, it would have taken several years, multiple years for that census to be completed. So it could have been finished maybe in the years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 BC may have been this actual census that Luke talks about. So we're in the general framework of the time period we're going to establish for the birth of Jesus. Just another interesting piece of evidence in the Bible from Luke's gospel. A third clue, and this is the most significant one that we're going to look at, comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. And this is where the Magi, the wise men, they came to Jerusalem and they asked Herod, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So the Bible tells us that this star led the wise men to Bethlehem. So what was this star? All right, let's look at a couple of possible theories, and then we're going to look at one that the Star of Bethlehem video makes pretty clear. So here are the different theories. Some people believe maybe this was simply Halley's Comet. We can go back and look at astronomy charts, records, and we can see exactly when Halley's Comet would have appeared in the skies above the Earth. And the only recorded occurrence of Halley's Comet anywhere near the time of the birth of Jesus would have been in the years 11 and 12 BC. So this is way outside the parameters of what we've already established. But here's Halley's Comet. This is the last time it appeared in our skies. It was back in 1986. Certainly a bright light there in the sky. Certainly, wow, you could imagine that maybe would have caught the wise men's attention. But again, the time frame just doesn't match up with the biblical clues that we've already looked at. The other reason why we can eliminate Halley's Comet is that everyone in the world would have noticed that, just like they do today. Everybody would have noticed the appearance of a comet. In fact, a comet was usually a preview, a prophecy about gloom and doom. Everybody thought the world would end when Halley's Comet appeared. And certainly God wouldn't mark the birth of Jesus with a heavenly mark of doom and gloom. And it's obvious that Herod and all of his scholars, they would have known about Halley's Comet, and they were certainly unaware about this star that the wise men saw. So we can pretty well eliminate Halley's Comet as a possibility. Others maybe speculate this was a recurring supernova. That's an exploding star. And here's an actual picture of one of these supernovas in 1987. But we can go back and again look at astronomical records, and there are no records of any supernovas anywhere near the time frame that we're looking at for the birth of Jesus in the years somewhere between 2 and 4 BC. So we can eliminate this possibility. Others talk about an aligning of the planets. You know, we talked about Jupiter and Saturn coming together now. Well, this happens on a regular basis, not very often, but very regularly, very precisely, an aligning of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. And here you see a picture of these three planets as they converge together. Again, historical astronomical records state that this conjunction actually occurred in 7 to 6 BC. So that's a little bit outside the time frame that we're establishing for the birth of Jesus, sometime between 2 and 4 BC. Let's talk about this idea of the planets. Back in the ancient world, back in the New Testament times, planets were called wandering stars. And that's because of the way the planets seemed to move across the skies. They wandered through the skies as people observed them from the earthly frame of reference. They would see the planets moving among the stars. So stars, planets were all considered one phenomenon, but the planets were called wandering stars. So hang on to that, because we're going to come back to that significant detail in just a few moments. All right, the last possibility, and now we're going to get to a very real possibility for the Star of Bethlehem. Many scholars, many astronomers believe that the star might have been a conjunction of the planet Jupiter, that's always been known as the king planet, and the planet Venus, and that's always been known as the mother planet. And lo and behold, we can go back in astronomical records, and there was this exact conjunction that occurred in 2 BC. That happened exactly when the time frame we're looking at for the birth of Jesus, before the death of Herod, before 1 BC. So maybe in 2, 3, 4 BC, that's when Jesus would have been born. That's why we can make a very strong argument that this may well have been one of the heavenly phenomenons that led the wise men there to Bethlehem. And here's a picture from June the 28th of 2015, and you can see Jupiter and Venus coming together as they converge. It's like they form one star. And you can see how bright that light would be in the skies. So hang on to that hypothesis, because we're going to come back to this as very significant in looking at the birth of Jesus. So, wow, if this was the convergence of Jupiter and Venus, maybe this was the event that led the wise men there to Bethlehem. As they looked up in the nighttime skies, they would have seen this very, very bright star, this convergence of the planets. So here's our hypothesis. Perhaps the Star of Bethlehem wasn't just one phenomenon that happened. Perhaps it was a whole series of starry planetary events by which God was proclaiming the birth of Jesus in the heavens. So let's go back. Let's take this astronomy software and let's see what was happening in the skies there in the Middle East around the time of the birth of Jesus. And guess what? We're going to find some very, very significant heavenly phenomena that were happening at that very time. So when was Jesus born? Well, according to this Star of Bethlehem video, let's start even before his birth. Jesus was conceived, we might say his life began, on September the 11th of 3 BC. Now, how in the world do we arrive at that? Well, guess what happened in the skies on that very day? On this date, there was a triple conjunction of Jupiter, that's the king planet, and a star, Regulus. That's always been known as the king star. They would have converged near each other 3 times over a period of time. So as Jupiter, again, that was one of these wandering stars, as it moved through the heavenly bodies, over a period of time, it would approach Regulus and then move away. It would come back and approach Regulus and move away, and then a third time approach the king star Regulus and then move away. That's a very rare occurrence. And this may well have been what the wise men, these magi, observed as they studied the heavens. These guys were the ancient astronomers of their days. They would have kept meticulous notes as they noticed things that were happening with the heavenly bodies. And this would have definitely caught their attention, this triple conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus. So why do we say this has to do with the conception of Jesus? Well, perhaps this was marking something significant. Maybe it was on this very date that the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her that she would be with child. We call this the Annunciation of Mary. So maybe this event marked the conception of Jesus, September the 11th of 3 BC. Well, again, the wise men, they surely would have noted this event. This triple conjunction was so rare. King planet, king star. they would have said, something is going on here. Let's take note of this. A king planetary conjunction. A king conjunction. King. Maybe they were saying this is going to have something to do with a new king. By the way, these wise men, they may well have been from a certain Eastern school of magi who may have even descended from the prophet Daniel. If you remember your Old Testament history, Daniel never left Babylonian captivity when the Jews were taken away into captivity. He stayed there. Well, if these magi were descendants of Daniel, this would explain why these wise men were so interested in a Jewish king. They would have been familiar with prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, their knowledge of the Jewish scriptures. Why would a bunch of secular, pagan, atheistic magi care anything about Old Testament scripture and prophecy? They wouldn't care anything about Jewish events. So the fact that these magi may have been descendants of Daniel, I think, is a very significant and interesting detail. All right, so it was this triple conjunction happens, marking perhaps the conception of Jesus there on September the 11th of 3 BC. Let's fast forward 9 months later. Jesus was conceived in September. What happened 9 months later? June the 17th of 2 BC. Jesus now enters this world. Here is the birth date of Jesus. Now, why do we say that? Well, let's take this astronomy software and go back and see what significant things were happening in the heavenly bodies on this date, June the 17th, 9 months after that first occurrence there of something unusual happening. What happened on that date? On this day, there was a conjunction of these two planets, Jupiter, the king planet, Venus, the mother planet. And again, the wise men, this would have been very significant to them, seeing these two particular planets coming together. Perhaps this was signifying to them that a new king had been born somewhere to a new mother. King planet, mother planet. This is no coincidence, the wise men must have thought. Something was happening here. In fact, 9 months earlier, we saw something significant happening, maybe the conception of a new king. Now, perhaps this is marking the birth of a new king. And again, here is this conjunction, a typical what it looks like in the skies, Venus and Jupiter coming together. It would have been the brightest light in the sky. Everybody would have seen it. The wise men would have certainly noted it. And the conjunction of these two planets meant something significant had happened. And this is from March of 2012, a picture there of the convergence of Jupiter and Venus. All right, so the wise men see this conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in June of 2 BC, and now they say, you know what? Maybe a new king has been born. So they begin their journey to Judea as they see this conjunction. They were in the east. As they look to the western sky, they see this conjunction, and that's what signals them, let's head west. And so they now begin that familiar journey to Jerusalem. And this was, you can see the wise men, they started here over in the right. This is in the area of Babylon or Iraq, which is where these wise men came from. Again, could have well been descendants of Daniel. And they make their long journey all the way to Jerusalem. And it takes them about 6 months to get there. It's about a 600-mile journey. Now they arrive at Jerusalem, and now we get the story of their coming before King Herod. So if it took 6 months, now we're to the month of December. So hang on to that. Around December of 2 BC, they get there to Herod. They ask, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? We want to worship him. And Herod asked all of his religious experts, and they know the prophecies about the coming of this Jewish king, and they say he is to be born in Bethlehem. By the way, we don't know for sure how many wise men there really were. The Bible doesn't tell us, does it? No. It could have been 2, 3, 4, could have been a dozen. But traditionally, people say 3 wise men because of what? The 3 gifts that were given to Jesus. So from there in Jerusalem, now they're going to head south. They were told to go to Bethlehem. They head south to find this newborn king of the Jews. So now we're to mid to late December. But remember, Jesus has already been born. This is 6 months later. So they're heading down to Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, there on the map you see, is, just below Jerusalem. It's about a 5-6 mile journey. They head out, get the geographical location. They're heading south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. All right, we're talking about December. We're talking about Jesus, events surrounding his birth. How did we ever arrive at the birth date for Jesus of being December the 25th? Well, this was not the actual birth date of Jesus, but this became the traditional date for Christians as they attempted to Christianize a very popular pagan festival of the winter solstice. So they Christianized this, and they just said, we're going to start celebrating the birth of Jesus on this festival. And in AD 385, Pope Julius I declared December the 25th as the official date of Jesus's birth. And that's kind of stuck on our calendars ever since. But we know this couldn't have happened on December the 25th because the Bible tells us the shepherds were in the fields by night. Jesus's birth, for that to happen, shepherds wouldn't be out in the fields with their sheep at night in December, in the wintertime. No, it would have been in the springtime. It would have been in April or June. And that's why very early on, by 200 AD, most theologians and scholars have speculated that Jesus was born sometime in the spring. They even speculated on dates, May the 20th or April the 17th. And as we saw there, what was happening in the heavenly skies, June the 17th was the date that the Star of Bethlehem video arrives at for the birth of Jesus. So now you know how December the 25th is the date on our calendars that we celebrate the birth of Jesus, but that's just a traditional date affixed many, many years ago, not the real birth date of Jesus. But this is what's very interesting. Remember the wise men, they're heading down, they're headed south out of Jerusalem down toward Bethlehem. This is mid to late December. Interestingly, perhaps the wise men arrived there in Bethlehem on that exact date of December the 25th. Now, again, we're not saying this is the birth date of Jesus. He had already been born, 6, 7 months earlier. Then the wise men arrived there. But it's interesting to think about the fact that they may have well arrived on that very date of December the 25th of 2 BC. Why? Again, something significant happening in the heavenly bodies. On this date, you can take this astronomy software and go back and look what was happening. If you were to put yourself in Jerusalem looking south and you looked up in the sky on that particular date, you would have seen this. You would have seen Jupiter, the king planet. It had now stopped as it moved its way, this wandering star, as it made its way through the skies. It would appear to have stopped in its wandering, in its motion through the skies. This is that retrograde motion. Again, this is why the planets seem to move around in our nighttime skies. We're observing the planets from a moving object, the planet Earth. So as the Earth is making its way around the sun, we're a moving object, and we're going to see these other moving objects as they make their way around the sun. And that's what's going to lead to this phenomenon of retrograde motion. And lo and behold, as the wise men headed due south out of Jerusalem, headed toward Bethlehem, Jupiter, the brightest star, the brightest wandering star, the brightest planet in the skies that night, it would have come to a stop as they observed it right over Bethlehem. This kind of gives you goosebumps, doesn't it? Here's that phenomenon of a retrograde motion. This is a time-lapse photography here. You see Jupiter as it moves through our field of vision. So this is why these are called wandering stars. And you can see over a period of weeks, Jupiter makes its way as we're looking up, makes its way across the sky, and it slows down, and then it appears to stop. And then it continues on this spiraling journey, and it looks like it stops. This is that retrograde motion, and then it continues on its journey through our skies. So this retrograde motion, think about it. The wise men, experts in astronomy, and they see Jupiter there just before them as they're heading out of Jerusalem down to Bethlehem, and they notice that Jupiter, the largest light in the sky, slows down and almost comes to a complete stop. And this actually occurred. We can use this astronomy software. This actually occurred, guess what, on December the 25th of 2 BC. If you were to take this software, put yourself back there in Jerusalem on that very date, put your heading looking south. If you look up into the sky, what would you have seen? You would have seen Jupiter coming to a retrograde stop. And it would have stopped as the wise men looking south from Jerusalem, looking down to Bethlehem, it would have stopped right over Bethlehem. And there's a picture. So let's imagine this star, this wandering planet, Jupiter, brightest light in the sky. It's been moving, and now it comes to a complete stop. Wise men here heading south out of Jerusalem down to Bethlehem. They see Jupiter stopping in its retrograde motion on December the 25th of 2 BC, right over Bethlehem. So this was the marker. This is what sent them to that location, and God marked it very possibly with this heavenly phenomenon. So yeah, there's a familiar Christmas picture there of the wise men arriving there at Bethlehem. And here is the Bethlehem star. On this occasion, it was the planet Jupiter, the king planet, lighting up the evening sky. So we've seen a series of different heavenly phenomena, conjunctions of planets and stars. This star, this wandering planet, leading the way for the wise men to Bethlehem. So again, this wasn't the birth of Jesus. This happened later. 6 months later, they arrived there. Jesus has already been born, and that's why most of our traditional pictures about the birth of Jesus there, the manger scene, the wise men arriving there in the manger to see the baby Jesus, very inaccurate, because Jesus was no longer a newborn. He was not a baby. In fact, Matthew 2:11 says the wise men came not to a manger, not to a barn, the stable. It says they came to the house, and they saw the child with his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshiped him. They came to a house, and they saw the child. Very interesting Greek word that's used there. It's not the Greek word for a newborn baby, an infant. This is the word that would be used for a child, a toddler, not a baby, a toddler. So Matthew 2:1-11 supports the idea. The wise men didn't arrive there at the manger. They came to a house that Mary and Joseph were now living in there in Bethlehem. Yeah, they arrived at a house, not a manger, to see the infant. Literally, it's a toddler. So maybe the more accurate pictures would be these showing the wise men arriving. This isn't a stable, a barn, a manger. This is a house. And look, Jesus is not a newborn baby. He's like 6 months old. Same in this picture. This is obviously a house where the wise men arrived there. And Jesus, not a baby Jesus in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. This is the infant Jesus. So let's wrap it up and summarize some interesting things we've learned about Christmas. If Herod died in 1 BC, and that's the best manuscript evidence we have from Josephus, Jesus must have been born sometime prior to that. So he must have been born 2, 3, 4 BC. Our thesis is, what if God announced the birth of Jesus in the heavens? What if there were some unusual star and planetary events? In other words, the Star of Bethlehem video. Were there some unusual, observable astronomical phenomena that happened around the year 2 BC? The answer is yes. The wise men, these magi, these ancient astronomers in Eastern School of Magi in Babylon, perhaps descendants of Daniel, they were meticulous observers of the heavens. They also were probably well acquainted with the Jewish scriptures. So this is why they'd be interested in the birth of a Jewish king. On September the 11th, 2 BC, here's that triple conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter. This is the king star, the king planet. Remember, this would have meant something to these magi. King, king, king star, king planet. Perhaps this was the Annunciation of Mary, Jesus's conception, he who would be truly the King of Kings. Maybe the wise men, they would have made a note of that. 9 months later, all right, now we get to the birth of Jesus, June the 17th of 2 BC. This was that conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, king planet, mother planet. The wise men head west, following the star, following these wandering planets. 6 months later, it takes them to arrive there in Jerusalem. Now we're in mid-December. They are told by Herod, go to Bethlehem. They head south from Jerusalem toward Bethlehem. And what do they see? On the southern horizon, they see Jupiter, the king planet, come to a full retrograde motion stop. Jupiter appears to stop right over Bethlehem. And no surprise there. When did the wise men arrive there? It could well have been exactly on December the 25th of 2 BC. We might say that was the first Christmas, not the birth of Jesus, but the first Christmas, the first giving of gifts, which is what we celebrate on Christmas. And the Bible tells us they arrive at a house, not a manger, to see the, not to see an infant, but literally a toddler, wasn't a baby. So what's our conclusion? Jesus was born on June the 17th, not December the 25th. And again, remember, it was in AD 385 that Pope Julius I declared December the 25th becomes the official calendar date to observe Jesus's birth. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and come back and wrap things up. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. I love that. I've got to believe God was up to something there in the heavenly bodies. I don't think it's a coincidence. If we take the biblical pieces of evidence, we can establish the approximate time that Jesus would have been born, sometime around 2, 3, 4 BC. And then if we look up into the skies using that astronomy software, we see some very, very significant conjunctions, movements of planets and stars that seem to mark the key events. The conception of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, and even the arrival of the wise men there in Bethlehem to present their gifts. All right, I hope you will keep this video. You might want to go back and review it from time to time. A lot of information I've given to you, but let's praise God that our sovereign God, you know what this really means? Our sovereign God, before he even created the universe, he must have known the exact moment that Jesus entered this world. because the planets are so regular in their movements. God must have known when he cast the planets into the universe, when he created all this, he must have known that he would mark the entry of Jesus into this world by declaring and proclaiming something significant through the heavenly bodies that he created. All right, interesting lesson. Hope you have a great week. Hope you're getting prepared for Christmas or in this Advent season, getting ready, preparing for the coming of Christmas. And I think this lesson this week ought to do a lot to help us marvel and think about that Star of Bethlehem some 2,000 years ago. God bless you, Pathfinders, and I'll see you back again next week.